Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History. I first want to thank everyone who has supported and giving me that first milestone when it comes to subscribers. It really, really, really means a lot. And I'm definitely looking forward to growing this with all of you. And hopefully, there will be more to come. You could follow anyone else, but you chose to follow me, and that really means a lot. Anyways, regarding the content of the video, I am going to be talking about East Asia. And before we get into that, I want to break down what East Asia is as a region, an anthropological, ethnic, and potentially from a racial area and lens. So, East Asia is one of the world's oldest and most influential cultural regions. It can be understood through several different lenses, the ones that I kind of just mentioned, and each tell a slightly different story. So, as a geographic region, the core of East Asia generally includes China, Japan, North and South Korea, Mongolia, and Taiwan. Sometimes the broader definitions include Hong Kong, Macau, parts of the Russia Far East, and occasionally Tibet and Xinjiang within China. East Asia as a civilizational region. So, anthropologically, East Asia is often better understood as a civilization than merely a location. So, for over 2,000 years, China functioned similarly to how Rome influenced Europe. Major shared traditions include historically Chinese writing, Confucian ethics, Buddhism, Taoism, ancestor worship, imperial bureaucracy, and rice agriculture, especially in the southern parts of East Asia. Countries adopted these ideas differently. As an anthropological region, it's of, East Asia is often divided into several ecological zones. So there's Northern East Asia, which includes Mongolia, Northern China, and Manchuria, which is traditionally characterized by pastoralism, horse culture, nomadic empires, and wheat and Malay farming, with influence from the Xiangsu, Turks, Khitans, Mongols, and Manchurese. Then there's Central East Asia, which is the Yellow River Basin. It's the birthplace of the Han Chinese civilization, Shang Dynasty, the Zhao Dynasty, and Confucianism, and it's often viewed as the historical core of Chinese civilizations. And then there is Southern East Asia, which is centered on the Yangtze River and farther south. It's historically associated with rice agriculture, subtropical forests, and Austroasiatic and Tat-speaking peoples before gradual Han expansion. So much of southern China became predominantly Han through centuries of migration and cultural assimilation. And then there's Island East Asia. So this includes Japan, Taiwan, and the Ryukyu Islands. So these developed somewhat independently after the last ice age, though later deeply influenced by China. So when it comes to the ethnic landscape, East Asia has one of the largest majority populations across many minorities. So there's the Han Chinese, which is approximately 1.3 billion people, and it's around 91% of China's population, and it's considered the largest ethnic group on Earth. I didn't know that. You learn something new every day. Then there's the Japanese, which is relatively homogeneous. They descended largely from the Jomon populations, the Yayoi migrants from the Korean Peninsula and mainland East Asia. Then there are the Koreans, which are among the world's most genetically homogeneous national populations. They have a long history of continuity on the Korean Peninsula. Then there are the Mongols, which is distinct from the neighboring agricultural societies. They are historically pastoral, nomadic, and steppe peoples. Then there are the Tibetan peoples, so they adapted to high altitude life. They are unique genetic adaptation of or for oxygen utilization. So when it comes to linguistic diversity, there are major families which includes the Sino-Tibetan, which is pretty much the languages of Mandarin, Cantonese, Tibetan, and Burmese. The Japonic, which includes Japanese, Ryukyuan, hopefully I said that correctly. If I don't, I apologize. Languages, Koreanic, which is Korean, Mongolic, which is Mongolian, and Tungusic, which is Manchu, and Evenki. Now I'm going to talk about why they and their descendants are grouped together today. So the first reason is shared deep ancestry. So from a genetic point of view, the people of East Asia are grouped together because they derive much of their ancestry from populations that expanded across Eastern Eurasia after the last ice age. So pretty much with today's population of East Asians, many trace substantial ancestry to ancient populations such as the ancient Northeast Asians, the Yellow River farming populations, the Yangtze River farming populations, and ancient hunter-gatherers of Eastern Eurasia. So over thousands of years, these people mixed into different proportions of East Asians. So that means the Han Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, many Siberian people, and many indigenous peoples of Taiwan are more closely related to one another than they are to populations from Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Western Asia, although there's considerable variation and overlap amongst East Asians. The second reason is geographic isolation. So East Asia developed within a relatively connected region that was nonetheless bounded by major natural barriers like the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, the Gobi Desert, the Pacific Ocean, the Siberian Forest, and the Central Asian steppes. So these barriers reduced large-scale migration from other regions for long periods of time, allowing many local populations to share long-term ancestry while still developing their own identities. So the third reason is the shared cultural sphere. So unlike Europe, where influence was spread among multiple major powers, East Asia was strongly shaped by China for over 2 millennia, so over 2,000 years. Many neighboring societies adopted or adapted Chinese writing systems, historically at least, Confucian philosophy, Buddhism, legal codes, administrative systems, and artistic traditions. So this created what historians sometimes called the East Asian cultural sphere of Sinosphere. So the fourth reason is similar physical traits, so essentially the similar phenotype. Historically, observers noticed that many East Asian populations also shared certain physical traits and characteristics at the population level, like their hair color and the type of hair texture that they have, the low facial density, epicantic folds, and similar broad patterns of facial morphology. And obviously, these observations contributed to older racial classifications, essentially them being called Mongoloid. And while modern anthropology recognizes that that term especially is obsolete, modern anthropologists still somewhat connect them together with a lot of similar bases, though it's kind of worded differently, if that makes sense. The fifth reason are modern racial categories. So, in countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, and even in many other places of the world, people whose ancestry comes from East Asia are often grouped together under the broad racial category Asian, distributing largely for historical and administrative reasons like immigration records, census categories, civil rights law, and demographic statistics. These categories simplify a very diverse set of populations and do not map neatly onto genetics or culture. And the sixth reason are their descendants. So, people of East Asian descent living elsewhere in the world are often grouped together because they generally retain ancestry from East Asian populations, even as they become culturally integrated into their new countries of residence. For example, Chinese Americans, Japanese Brazilians, Korean Canadians, Taiwanese Australians may have very different languages, national identities, and family histories, but they're often categorized together in demographic or racial context because of shared ancestral origins in East Asia, which makes sense. At the same time, many individuals identify more with their family's nationality or other ethnic background. So, an example, some just say, oh, I'm Chinese, I'm Japanese, I'm Hmong, I'm Korean, rather than identifying as East Asian or having a pro or pan East Asian identity. Now we are at the point where I go over a timeline. So the first point is prehistoric East Asia. This is from 40,000 to 10,000 BCE. So this is where the arrival of the modern humans came to be. So anatomically, modern humans arrived in East Asia roughly 400 to 50,000 years ago. These populations spread across China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Siberia, and Taiwan. During this period, hunting, fishing, and gathering were the dominant lifestyles, though different populations became increasingly adapted to local environment, from the Siberian taiga to the subtropical southern China. And at this point, Japan was periodically still connected to the mainland by land bridges during the period of lower sea levels, and the earliest ancestors of the Japanese arrived during this area. The Jomon culture later developed one of the world's oldest known pottery traditions. Now we are in the Neolithic Revolution. So this is from 10,000 to 2000 BCE. So this is where agriculture begins. So this happened around 9,000 to 7,000 BCE, where agriculture independently emerged in parts of China. The two major farming centers developed in northern China, which is the Yellow River, and then the main crop had millet, and this became the cradle of early Chinese civilization. So the first is the Yellow River, and the second is the Yangtze River, which is in southern China. So pretty much one river in northern China, the second in southern China. So regarding the Yangtze River, the main crop that was grown here is rice, and rice agriculture would eventually spread throughout much of East and Southeast Asia. There were permanent villages that were being formed, and large settlements emerged featuring pottery, weaving, domesticated pigs and dogs, and early religious rituals, as well as ancestor worship, where many of the foundations of later East Asian culture appeared during this period. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Bronze Age state. So this is from roughly around 2000 to 1046 BCE. So the first one is the Xiai dynasty, which is traditionally dated to be around the period from 2070 to 1600 BCE. So Chinese historical texts describe it as the first dynasty, though archaeological evidence remains debated about that. The second is the Shang dynasty, which is from 1600 to 1046 BCE. This is the first dynasty that's really supported by clear archaeological evidence, so I guess the debate between these two. Major developments during this period included bronze, metallurgy, writing, i.e., oracle bones or on oracle bones, organized armies, royal courts, and large cities. This marks the beginning of the continuous written Chinese history. Then there's the Zhao dynasty that went from 1046 to 256 BCE. So the Zhao overthrew the Shang and ruled for nearly 800 years. So the major ideas that developed during this dynasty is the mandate of heaven, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. The era also saw advances in iron tools, irrigation, philosophy, and warfare. Towards the end, China fragmented into competing states. So this also goes to the Warring States period, which was happening pretty much around the same time, from 475 to 221 BCE. So China became divided among powerful kingdoms. The period produced remarkable intellectual and technological developments, but was also marked by intense warfare. Major thinkers during this period included Confucius, Laozi, which is traditionally associated with Taoism, Mazi, and the Han Fezi. We then have the Qian dynasty, which is a very, very, very short dynasty which ranged from 221 to 206 BCE. And the main significance of this is that this is the first time where China was fully unified. Achievements during this dynasty included standardized writing and weights, unified currency, extensive road systems, and the early Great Wall fortifications. So the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, created one of history's first highly centralized bureaucratic empires. Okay, and then we have the Han Dynasty, which is from 206 BCE to 220 CE. It is often compared to the Roman Empire in terms of influence and equivalency. So the major developments include the Silk Road trade, expansion into Korea and Central Asia, paper invention, Confucian government, and flourishing literature and science. Many modern Han Chinese trace their cultural identity to this era. Now we're going to focus on the formation of the neighboring states, which happened from the first millennium BCE to 700 CE. So the first is Korea. So early kingdoms emerged in Korea, including the Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. I apologize ahead of time or after the fact for my mispronunciation of these. Korea adapted the Chinese writing, Buddhism, and Confucian administrations while maintaining its own language and identity. While with Japan, the Yayoi period brought rice farming, metallurgy, and increasing social complexity. By the 6th and 7th century CE, Japan had adopted Buddhism, Chinese writing like kanji, and many administrative ideas while developing distinct institutions and culture. Now we are moving on to the age of the great empires, which range from 600 to 900 CE. So the Tang dynasty is often regarded as China's golden age. Chang'an became one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan cities at the time, where the Tang period saw flourishing poetry, painting, international trade, Buddhist influence, and diplomatic ties across Asia. In Korea, we had the Unified Silla, which caused Korea to experience political consolidation and cultural flourishing, while the Nara and Han Japan saw Japan developing court culture, classical literature, including the tale of Genji, and distinctive art and architecture. Now we are at the Song Dynasty. So this is from the 960 to 1279. That's the years, essentially. So this is seen as one of the world's most innovative periods. Innovations included the movable type printing, gunpowder applications, magnetic compass, advanced shipbuilding, and widespread paper money. Urbanization and commerce expanded dramatically during this period. Now we are on to the Mongol era, which ranged from 1206 to 1368. So this became the largest continuous or contiguous land empire in history. Effects included the unification of much of Eurasia, increased Silk Road trade, cultural exchange, movement of technologies and ideas, and China became the Yuan dynasty under the Mongol rule. Korea became a tributary state while Japan successfully resisted two Mongol invasions. We are moving on to the Ming Dynasty, which ranged from 1368 to 1644. The Ming restored Han Chinese rule. Major achievements include the reconstruction of the Great Wall, voyages of Zhang He across the Indian Ocean, growth of cities, porcelain production, and artistic flourishing. I also want to talk about Edo, Japan, which ranged from 1603 to 1868. So, Japan entered a long era of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. Characteristics of this included political stability, urban growth, samurai administration, limited foreign contact, vibrant arts, including ukiyo-e, print, and kabuki theater. Then we have the Qing dynasty, which lasted from 1644 to 1912, and the Manchu-led king became China's last imperial dynasty. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent, incorporating regions such as Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. By the 19th century, however, China faced internal rebellions, economic pressures, defeats in the Opium Wars, and increasing foreign intervention. Now I'm going to talk about the modernization and imperialism that took place in the 1800s during or within East Asia. So in Japan, the Meiji Restoration, which took place in 1868, transformed Japan through rapid industrialization and modernization. Within decades, Japan became a major military and industrial power. In China, the king struggled to modernize while confronting internal unrest and foreign pressure. The dynasty fell in 1912, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. In Korea, it was historically influenced by China, but Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910, beginning 35 years of colonial rule. Now we're moving on to World War II, which in this video I'm framing it from 1931 to 1945. So those were the exact time frames where the war took place, if that makes sense. Anyways, East Asia experienced one of the most destructive conflicts in its history. Major events included the Japanese expansion into Manchuria in 1931, the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945, the Pacific War, the awful atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's surrender in 1945. The war reshaped the political map of the region. Now we're moving on to the Cold War, East Asia. So this is from 1945 to 1991. Major developments during this period include People's Republic of China being established in 1949. The Republic of China's government relocated to Taiwan in that same year. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 led to the division of the peninsula, hence now having North Korea and South Korea. Japan's rapid post-war economic recovery took place during this period, and South Korea and Taiwan industrialized rapidly from the 1960s onward. And now we are finally at contemporary East Asia, which I'm titling from 1991 to the present day as I'm recording this. Today, East Asia is one of the world's most influential regions. Key characteristics include it being home to about 1.7 billion people, and that's not even including their diasporic populations. They have several of the world's largest economies. They are global leaders in manufacturing, electronics, robotics, and artificial intelligence. Rapid urbanization alongside aging populations in countries such as Japan and South Korea, and ongoing geopolitical issues, including the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, and maritime disputes. So the next section is about the average phenotype of East Asians, and before I even get into it, I want to state that there is no single East Asian phenotype because East Asians consist of over 1.7 billion people and dozens of ethnic groups. But if we're breaking it down to the average phenotype, here is what it would generally look like. And these are statistical averages, not defining characteristics of every single individual. So, when it comes to their skin color, the typical range is either light beige, light tan, olive beige, or medium beige. Compared to globally, they're generally lighter than many tropical Southeast Asians. They're on average somewhat darker than Northern Europeans, though there is some overlap. Northern East Asians tend to be lighter than Southern East Asians on average, reflecting geography and historical adaptation. When it comes to their hair, the overwhelming majority have natural black to very dark brown hair. They have straight hair, thick individual hair shafts, and relatively high hair density. Hair texture can range from pin straight to slightly wavy, but tight curls are uncommon. When it comes to their eyes, most of them have dark brown irises. Medium shaped eyes and epicanthic folds are common but not universal. The shape and prominence of the eyelids usually vary considerably amongst individuals and populations. When it comes to their face shape, they often have broad to medium cheekbones, relatively flat mid-face in many populations, a rounded or oval facial outline, moderate forehead height, and a generally smooth facial contours. When it comes to their nose, it's typically medium with relatively low to moderate nasal bridge with substantial variation, of course, and rounded, remotely defined nasal tip. Northern populations often have somewhat narrower and more projecting noses than southern populations, though there is some overlap. They generally have medium fullness when it comes to their lips, and the lower lip is often slightly fuller than their upper lip. When it comes to their facial hair, they have a lower density of beard growth than many West Eurasian or some South Asian populations. Their mustaches and beards can certainly develop but often grow more sparsely on average. And when it comes to their body build, they're historically medium stature, they have lean to medium body frames, and the current averages vary, where South Koreans and Japanese are among the taller East Asian populations. While Northern Chinese tend to be taller on average than Southern Chinese people, and Mongolians also tend to be relatively tall. Okay, so Northern East Asians like the Northern Han Chinese, Koreans, and Mongolians tend to have lighter skin, a taller stature, broader faces, stronger jawlines, and more prominent cheekbones, while the Southern East Asians includes the Southern Han Chinese people, many Southern minority groups, and indigenous peoples of Taiwan, where they generally tend to have slightly darker average tones, somewhat narrower faces in many groups, slightly shorter average stature, and greater genetic diversity, reflecting the ancient populations of southern China. So now I'm going to talk about their relationship with race. So from a biological perspective, modern biology and genetics do not recognize discrete biological races with sharp boundaries. Instead, human genetic variation is continuous, i.e. clinical, overlapping or shaped by migration and geography. East Asians form a regional genetic cluster because of long-term shared ancestry and geographic proximity, but there's no single East Asian race in a strictly biological sense. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The Han Chinese and Koreans are genetically closer to one another than Europeans, duh. Japanese populations share much ancestry with mainland East Asians, but also have distinctive contributions from the ancient German populations. Tibetans have unique genetic adaptations to high altitude. Uyghurs often have substantial West Eurasian as well as East Asian ancestry. When it comes to the historical physical anthropology, during the 18th through much of the 20th century, many scholars attempted to divide humanity into small numbers of races. East Asians were commonly placed in a category historically called the Mongoloid race, which often included East Asians, many Siberian peoples, many indigenous peoples of the Americas, and sometimes Southeast Asians. The system relied mainly on visible phenotypical physical traits such as facial morphology, hair texture, eye features, and skin pigmentation. Obviously, this is now considered outdated because it oversimplifies human diversity and does not reflect modern genetic understanding. So, race as a social category. So, today, race is generally understood in the social sciences as a social construct, a way society classifies people based on perceived ancestry and physical appearance. In countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, people with ancestry from China, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, and many neighboring populations are often grouped into broad categories such as Asian, East Asian, or Asian American in the US context. These categories are useful for purposes like census data, public health research, civil rights protections, and demographic statistics. So, how East Asians have traditionally viewed identity. So, historically, people in East Asia generally did not organize identity around a broad racial category equivalent to East Asia. Instead, identities were more commonly based on ethnicity, i.e., Han, Tibetan, Mongol, Ainu, nationality, i.e., Chinese, Korean, Japanese, language, religion, or region, but I guess religion too, clan or lineage, and political allegiance. There are also the diasporas that you have to take into account. So, for descendants of East Asians living outside of the region, race often becomes more salient or a more salient social identity, i.e., Chinese Americans, Korean Canadians, Japanese Brazilians may identify with both their specific ethnic or national heritage and a broader Asian identity, particularly when responding to shared social experiences or participating in political and commonly or community organizations. So, all of the groups of people that are considered East Asians have differences in language, history, culture, ancestry, and physical characteristics, while still sharing varying degrees of deep regional ancestry. Okay, and that concludes my video on East Asians. I want to thank everyone who has to subscribe to help me get to that milestone mark, and everyone who is watching my videos. I'm really enjoying making these videos, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the future will bring. I can check East Asians off my um list for now, and I definitely have a few more places to cover. I have Central and South Africa, then Southeast Asia. I might do Siberia on its own. And then I'm going to do the Melanesias, the Polynesias, and the Micronesias. I don't know how I'm going to handle North America, but I even have ideas on how I'm going to cover other groups that aren't on this list or aren't focused specifically on a continental region. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Thank you all, and I'll be back with more content soon. Take care.